Hi everybody, Dan Bailey here with another Fujifilm camera tip for you. If you're an X Series shooter, then you probably already know how good the JPEGs can be right out of camera. In fact, this is one of the things that Fuji shooters love about the system. The image processing systems in these cameras is so good that you're able to get these incredible looking shots that have a high degree of tonal depth and a wonderful palette of colors. And of course, with the real-time live view of the electronic viewfinder or the LCD screen, you're able to see exactly what the picture is going to look like before you even press the shutter button. And of course, this can save you a huge amount of time because you don't have to shoot everything in RAW and then go back and process everything in order to get good looking shots. And no matter what X Series model you use, for the most part, these cameras do such an amazing job that you can get by with full confidence shooting JPEG in just about every situation, or at least a very wide array of situations and lighting conditions. But what about those times when you're shooting in really tricky light? You could shoot RAW, and in fact the X Series RAW files contain an enormous amount of information in them. But as I mentioned, shooting RAW means you have to spend more time processing your photos later, and that's time when you're far removed from the actual feelings and emotions and experiences that you felt when you were standing there on location shooting the photo in the first place. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and in fact there's nothing wrong with this approach, but in some situations, isn't it nice to just see the scene, pick up your camera, grab the shot, and walk away with an image you love? That's the kind of shooting mentality that tends to appeal to me for the most part these days. If there was only a way we could deal with tricky light when shooting in JPEG mode that would allow us better results, well, thankfully there is. One of the best tools the Fujis have are the highlight and shadow tone controls, which are found inside the Q menu, and they're labeled as H-tone and S-tone. Now, I know there's a lot of Fuji shooters out there who haven't ever played around with these controls, and in fact it took me a couple years to dive in and figure out what they do. But once I saw how useful they were, they became an integral part of my shooting with the Fuji cameras. It just gives me more confidence and allows me to better deal with scenes that have sometimes challenging and tricky light. So here's how they work. Using the highlight and shadow tone controls, you can increase or decrease the highlights and the shadows, or the very bright parts of your scene, or the very dark parts of your scene, just as if you had post-processing software built right into the camera. In a sense, you do. That's exactly what they are. Only instead of using sliders on the computer, you use the command dial to adjust how bright and dark your highlights and shadows are going to be. And the best part is that you can use these controls to adjust your scene before you take the picture instead of after. And you can see the results. You can see exactly what the picture is going to look like before you take it in the LCD screen or in the electronic viewfinder. Now with both of these controls, the adjustments go from +4 down to -2, with plus always increasing contrast and minus always decreasing contrast. That's the easiest way to remember. And so this gives you just a really simple, convenient way to rescue some very bright highlights, or else you can use the shadow tone to lighten your darker areas, just give a shot a little bit more depth, or you can darken the shadow tones to give your photo a more high contrast, a more hard-edged look. Now one thing to note, with the newest models, the X Pro 3, the X100V, and the XT4, these cameras don't have separate highlight and shadow tone menu items. Going forward, Fuji has decided to combine these into one setting called Tone Curve. And so in the Tone Curve menu, you can still use the same adjustments, the +4 down to -2 for highlight and shadow tone, and they also give you a nice little graph so you can get a quick visual. It's similar to what you would see if you were adjusting curves in Photoshop. So you can adjust your highlight and shadow tones here, or as with all the other models, you can find these in the Q menu as well. So here's a little primer on how I use the highlight and shadow tone controls, and hopefully this will give you some ideas that you can use in your own photography as well. Highlights are tricky. Unlike shadows, you don't want very many highlights in your photo. In fact, most of the time, our exposure calculations and adjustments are based on trying to preserve the highlights, because once you blow them out, once you send those highlights tumbling over the far right edge of the histogram, you can't get them back. Now this is also true with shadows, and once you lose your shadows over the left side of the histogram, you can't get those back either, but that's usually not as big a deal. In fact, a lot of times we don't care. In fact, I like to say that shadows are your best friend in photography. Shadows can insinuate a sense of mystery in our photos, a sense of drama. They can also act as a strong compositional graphical element when using large areas of shadow tone in your photos. On the other hand, blown highlights rarely do anything for us in our photos. In fact, we often hate to see large, blown out, open areas of sky and water. they just look yucky in photos. They tend to not look very appealing. And so most of the time when we're doing our exposure calculations, we're trying to preserve those highlights and bring those back over the edge of the histogram. So the highlight tone control basically allows you to dial down those brighter areas of your photo. Of course, if your photo is totally blown, if you have highlights, huge amounts of highlights in your image, this highlight tone control is not going to do much. You won't be able to rescue all those blown highlights. But if you have small areas of the shot that are overexposed, you can dial those down a little bit so they're not quite so intrusive. So with this in mind, I find that the highlight tone control is not nearly as useful as the shadow tone control, but it can still be a viable option if you're shooting in JPEG and you're faced with some exceedingly high amount of contrast in your image. The highlight tone just allows you to bring those down and, as I said, make them a little less intrusive. Of course, the best solution is to try to avoid large areas of highlight in your photos. Sometimes it's just inevitable that you might have some of those in your composition. And so again, this tool allows you to wrangle those a little bit, bring them under control. I think the shadow tone control is one of the most powerful creative features on the Fuji cameras, and I find myself using it quite often. I'll use it to tweak my contrast levels, but I'll also use it to adjust my film simulations to create more stylized looks in my photography. The most common way to use the shadow tone is to bring up the darker tones to kind of lighten those up and alleviate contrast problems in your image. It's great for this, and here's an example of how I like to use it. Again, with an adjustment range of +4 to -2, the plus always gives you more contrast, and the minus gives you less contrast. So, using the shadow tone, with a plus setting, you're increasing your blacks, you're increasing your dark tones in the image. Whereas if you use a minus setting, like -2, you're decreasing the contrast and lightening up the shadows. So here's an example. Let's say you want to increase the level of blacks for more drama and harder contrast in your photo. Go for a couple notches up in the plus side and you'll watch your shadows get even darker. But what if you already have a high contrast image and you want to add a little bit more depth? You want to show a little more texture and detail in your darker areas. That's when you go minus. So if you make an adjustment of -2 on the shadow tone, you'll really start to open up your image, and you'll see this in the viewfinder. Here's another example, a photo shot in the forest under bright light. Now these kinds of scenes often present contrast problems, and so they're the kinds of situations where you normally revert to shooting raw. But by using the shadow tone controls on a Fuji, you're actually able to rescue some of these tones and save yourself some time and actually walk away with an image that works a little better than what you started with. It's really as simple as that. And the nice thing is that there's no price to pay. There's virtually no cost to this adjustment. You'd be hard-pressed to see any amount of additional noise or grain, especially when shooting at lower ISO levels. It's essentially a free bump in your shadows, and this is awesome because how often in life do we actually get something for free? So with the highlight and shadow tone controls, these two very simple adjustments give you a lot of flexibility and an increased level of confidence when you're shooting in tricky light. And this can be really valuable in those times where you still want to shoot JPEG, but you want to just make minor tweaks to the image. Maybe something's a little dark you want to lighten up, or you just want to rescue a little bit of the highlights. By making adjustments to one or both of these controls, you have a lot of leeway, you have a pretty powerful tool to help control that contrast or add contrast and really vary the look of your photos right in the camera. And again, by referencing the LCD screen or the electronic viewfinder, you can see exactly what the picture is going to look like before you take it. So again, these are very valuable tools that allow you to adjust your photos right in the camera and have even more confidence when shooting JPEG, even in tricky lighting conditions. In my next lesson, I'm going to expand on this and show you how to combine these tools and other settings in the Fuji cameras to create even more stylized and dramatic looks with your photography. And of course, if you're a Fuji shooter, you'll definitely want to check out my X Series Unlimited ebook. I've just updated it to the 2020 edition, and I cover all the new models and all of the newer settings that Fuji has introduced in the past couple years. As of right now, the latest edition is almost 400 pages of solid information that can help you get the best use out of your Fuji camera, no matter what kind of photography you like to shoot. So thanks for watching this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. Be sure and subscribe to my channel, and you can check me out on Instagram and Patreon at Dan Bailey Photo, and you can find me on the web at danbaileyphoto.com. So best of luck with your photography, and I'll see you next time.